invite Sarah Gordon to the stage? Oh, there she is. Thank you, Sarah.
I'm going to give Sarah Gordon a slightly bigger build-up than that. Although it doesn't look like you're staying because you've still got your coat on, or it's really much colder in here than I thought. But Sarah Gordon, you'll know, was the former chief executive of III. She's been a great friend to our event, and so it's a great pleasure to have her here today in her new capacity. And she asks a very pertinent question. So please, Sarah Gordon, ladies and gentlemen, give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Let me just check this is working and you can hear me. Yeah, so you can hear me. Yeah, great. That's going to involve me leaning over the lectern like one of those dipping toys. How's that? Better. Good. Okay. So really interesting to listen to that that group of people talking about the challenges of meeting some of the net zero targets. And I think I hope that this, what I'm going to talk about, will set some of the policy context that we started getting at the end of the discussion, but which I think David was saying is so incredibly important. You know, investors can do what they do, pension funds can do other things, but really the policy context sets the sort of parameters and the constraints, but also some of the opportunities for us to work in all our separate spheres. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the dangers but also I think the opportunities of what's happening with the UK government at the moment in terms of its policies around pensions and the future. And Maria, you were talking about I thought it was a massively optimistic version of what will happen. I mean, how quickly it will happen. But yes, if we do move to anything like an Australian or Canadian system of scale pension schemes, we're going to see an entirely different investment landscape. So very interesting moment. And I think when the new government came in, I think whatever your politics, I think most of us did at least feel a real sense of new energy, a fresh start. I think in the months since the new administration has been in power, there is a bit of worry that some of these very big policies have perhaps not been as fully thought through as some of us enacting and implementing on the ground would like to see. I mean, I live on, as some of you know, I live in Exmoor in the southwest of England in a very, very isolated rural community. It's entirely dependent. The basis of the rural economy is hill farming. And you'll know from the demonstrations in Westminster this week, the hill farmers on Exmoor are feeling pretty unlistened to, and that this government doesn't really understand the realities of farming in a place like Exmoor. And I think for many people in the pensions industry, there's a similar sense of sort of anxiety and concern that some of the big ideas that the government has got, which are potentially very exciting, very transformatory, but have not necessarily been thought through to quite the extent that all of us would wish. And I think that's being very much picked up on in the media. Sometimes, I mean, as also some of you know, I was a journalist for nearly 20 years at the Financial Times, and it's quite interesting now having a perspective on journalism outside it. It is a bit depressing how the media always picks up on the negatives. And the negatives around the pension policy are very much both individual savers and those representing those savers saying, we're really worried that that government policy is actually going to affect the performance of our pensions and our ability to have a proper pension pot when we retire, that of course all of us commit a lot of our salary and our planning to. And then at the same time, pension trustees, and I know there are some of you in the room today, but who take their fiduciary duty extremely seriously and saying, hold on, what you're actually saying, you're telling us you want us to invest in the UK, you're telling us you want us to commit more to private markets, but actually that's not compatible with our primary duty, which is to look after the savings of us, the people in this room, the individuals in this country, taxpayers, savers. So I think there's an enormous amount of anxiety, and I think that some of that anxiety is incredibly well founded. I was thinking this morning with the death of John Prescott, and one of the things I'd forgotten, and I was reading the obituary in the Times this morning, is that John Prescott was very associated with the public-private partnerships that characterised a big policy plank of the Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown Labour governments. And of course, the legacy of some of those public-private partnerships and of the private finance initiatives of the 1990s and early noughties, when the last Labour government thought, oh yes, fantastic, we'll work really closely with private investors, we'll mobilise private investment for public policy priorities. And some of that legacy has been incredibly painful. Incredibly painful. You know, crumbling schools, falling down hospitals, children dying in mouldy flats where, you know, in social housing where a lot of the financing was shifted over to the private sector. So there is reason to be anxious. I would say there's both a lot to learn from the legacy of the past, a lot to learn from the private finance initiatives and the public-private partnerships, and we have learnt those lessons, and I think there's a lot of people, I know there are people from the civil service here today working on this in this space, a lot that has been learnt from those experiences that we can now use incredibly positively and productively, and also a lot to learn from what's being done by our competitors overseas. And if we don't now really seize those opportunities to work much more collaboratively with the pools of private savings and investment, we're not going to just lose out here. We're also going to lose out internationally in terms of what our competitors are doing. So one of the big initiatives, of course, in the EU is the Green Deal, which commits was hoping to crowd in nearly 400 billion euros in private and public investment, and EU Invest is the blended finance element of that Green Deal. And of course, in the US, and I say this with some hesitation, of course, because we don't know what President-elect Trump, in fact, I shouldn't even smile, because actually there's not much to smile about in terms of the next US government's attitude to all the stuff that we in this room care about. But the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is an enormously ambitious program to mobilize private finance for net zero and environmental goals. And I know, and I'm sure many of you in this room know, particularly the asset managers, if you are trying to attract green investment to the UK at the moment, you're facing very, very significant competition from the US, where the incentives on offer under the Inflation Reduction Act are incredibly appealing. And of course, if President-elect Trump does choose to either reverse some or even all of the Inflation Reduction Act, although I think that will be quite difficult, he's going to potentially forego what are estimated by people like Goldman Sachs to be enormous benefits, both in terms of jobs, 1.5 million jobs, and very significant reductions in carbon emissions. And speaking to that very good question in the previous panel about how do individuals actually, how do we make the case to individuals that the transition is actually going to be good for them economically and in terms of their well-being over the next decades. One of the really interesting things about the Inflation Reduction Act is that there are very direct benefits to some of the communities which have suffered the most from the transition away from fossil fuels. So you're seeing some incredibly interesting, real regenerative sort of economic regeneration in some of the communities that have been hardest hit by the transition. So I think there are examples of policy initiatives in the rest of the world that we've really got, this government has really got a lot to learn from, and indeed must learn from them, because otherwise we're going to be out-competed. And I think the other, coming back to that Canadian and Australia example, we know that other countries can run pensions systems which, A, deliver fantastic returns for savers, but also invest incredibly productively and effectively in their national economies. So it's not like it hasn't been done elsewhere. Now, there are reasons. We have a very odd pension system in this country. I mean, the DB/DC divide, the misincentives, misalignments that have been introduced by various policy and regulatory interventions over the last 10 to 20 years have really created a very unique beast here. However, some of the initiatives out there, particularly around the consolidating the local government pension schemes funds, I do think show us a route to the future. And I thought, in terms of what would be useful for this audience, we've had a lot of very practical advice from our previous panel. What I've been doing at the LSE for the last nearly 2 years now is really trying to distill what best practice can look like when public and private investors work together. And, I've been very lucky, as Adrian says, I was the first chief executive of the UK Impact Investing Institute. And one of the things we tried to do there was really bring together different bits of the investment spectrum and bring the different experiences, both of social investors like Big Society Capital, we had LGIM, we had asset owners, USS, really try and share the different perspectives and approaches of those different investors or asset owners to try and distill what best practice actually looks like. Now, one of the problems with government, and I would speak very directly to some of the policymakers and civil servants in the room, is that far too often government says, we've got this fantastic idea, we're going to create, I don't know if you remember last year, there was the British Business Bank was going to create a venture capital fund where venture capitalists were going to give the British Business Bank their money so that the British Business Bank would invest in venture capital funds on their behalf. Now, the entire venture capital community in this country went, why would I do that? There's a mismatch between government and its, often incredibly good and creative and productive ideas, but actually doing the groundwork, first of all, of talking to the investment community, the investors, the asset owners, about what actually works for them and what is actually going to appeal to them. Now, I think we've seen some of that already happening with this new government around the National Wealth Fund, where, for what it's worth, the National Wealth Fund is not a fund. It's a $7.5 billion of assets that have been put on the UK Infrastructure Bank balance sheet to do deals. And that is one example of where I think a real opportunity has been missed, to go to the community, to go to investors like you in this room who really want to invest for net zero, for social justice, and to ask you, okay, what is it? What is the vehicle that you would find most appealing? What is the investment approach that would work for you? What is the risk-return profile that you need? What are the considerations that you have to, the requirements that you have to meet before you can invest? And that just doesn't happen enough. It doesn't happen enough from government at a national level. And we were talking earlier about the need for collaboration, and everyone always says collaboration needs to happen. But what does collaboration in this space between government and private investors actually look like? What does best practice actually look like? Adrian, tell me what time you want me to stop. Yeah. Do you want me to stop in 5 minutes? Because I do want to leave some time for questions. It's 12:20. Okay, I'll talk for a few more minutes, but then hopefully we can have time for some questions. I wanted to give you a few quick examples of some funds or some initiatives where public and private investors are working incredibly well together and delivering both fantastic financial return and positive impact. And I think one of the sort of slightly ironic things, and one of the things that this government and European and US governments find difficult, is that some of the most exciting and innovative blended finance vehicles have actually been trialled and have been successful in emerging markets. And we in this country are incredibly bad at looking at a fund in sub-Saharan Africa and saying, oh, that's really relevant to us. But actually it is. So there's a fantastic Africa Grow. It's a fund of funds run by Allianz Global Investors. It's got a lot of different government and private investors invested in it. But one of the most interesting things about it is that it shows what the role of government, where government can act most appropriately. And by that I mean, rather than investing directly in companies in sub-Saharan Africa, what it's doing is investing in private equity and VC investment firms in that region. So it's trying to strengthen the local investing ecosystem so that it can then invest in the companies which are going to grow and deliver growth and jobs. And I think that's an incredibly powerful idea for us in the UK, where we know, for example, down in the southwest, and I'm going to talk this evening at a event in Bristol where the West of England Combined Authority is launching a £100 million climate action fund. We know that part of the challenge in the regions in the UK is that you don't have the local investment expertise, the local investment ecosystem. So how do you create the intermediaries? It's not just there are plenty of growth opportunities all across the UK, but how do you really strengthen the intermediaries? So that was one example I wanted to draw your attention to. Another is the Clean Growth Fund set up by Beverly Gower Jones. A lot of you in the room will be familiar with it. It's a green tech investor. But the reason I wanted to mention that is that it's already got very significant local government pension scheme investors in it. Now, why is that? That's because Beverly, who is ex-fossil fuel industry, but big connections with government, sat down with the LGPS funds and said, okay, what is it you need? What's the profile of an investment fund that you could easily consider, that was a no-brainer for you? And that's essentially what the government needs to do, is create investment opportunities for you in this room that are like the green gilt. So the green gilt, it's a no-brainer for most pension schemes because it's low risk, it's guaranteed return, well, not guaranteed return, but semi-guaranteed return in this world of ours. It's not something that is difficult, it's not out of your comfort zone. What government needs to do is create those kind of opportunities which are fairly and squarely in the comfort zone already of pension funds, not making them feel, oh my God, we've got to take risk with our savers' money. And just, so there's that element of collaboration at the outset is absolutely critical. So across the blended finance examples that I've looked at in my research at the LSE, and I wrote a report about this last year, if that's of any interest to people in the room, but the most effective examples of public and private investors working together are those where from the outset there is a respect and a shared balance of power between the different investors, so that you collaborate, you co-design from that position of mutual trust and shared expectations. And I know that a lot of there is so much goodwill among private investors and public investors to work together, but too often the initiatives fail because that trust building and that sharing of power doesn't happen from the beginning, and it needs to. It also needs to be enshrined in the governance structures. So part of the problem with PFI, with private finance initiatives, is that, to characterise it in a slightly extreme way, government took all the risk and the private sector took all the reward. And you see that even now in Hinkley, which is down the nuclear power station near where I live, where EDF has basically got the government over a barrel and can say, you need to keep shifting the goalpost so that this makes sense for me, the private investor. You need to have a much more equitable power sharing structure in these initiatives for them to really work for the benefit of everyone, for savers, the public, government, taxpayers. And just to finish, I think that there is real opportunity here. I think part of the problem with the media reaction is that it makes us all focus on the risks, the negatives. For too long, we've had a pensions industry that's been incredibly risk averse. And I understand where that risk aversion comes from. But my hope is, and I know that this is Rachel Reeves and Treasury's hope as well, is that in creating these bigger, these scale vehicles, it's great. When you're USS, you can take risks, you can go into private markets. Part of the reason you can do that is because you've got the resource and the scale to operate confidently in those marketplaces. We will hopefully be moving to a pension system where there is greater scale, there is greater opportunity to take that risk and to make the return that comes with that risk and to work collaboratively with government in a way that is of benefit to us all. I'll stop there in the...
Well, don't stop too soon because we've got a couple of questions on Slido and I don't know if there's anybody else in the room who'd like to ask questions. Perhaps you'd ask the room if they want to ask anything.
Sure.
Anybody? Yes, a couple of hands. I've just reached over and given it to you, Stefan.
Thank you. Stéphane Pouillard, I'm chairman of Green Power House.
Oh, sorry, I thought we
all
were
right.
going over there.
I'm here. No, my question relates to competitiveness and the slow motions of Europe at large. I include the UK and Europe, if you don't mind, compared to what we see on the ground in China and in India. And 2 days ago, I was at the hydrogen conference in Europe, where the Indian Ministry of Energy was proudly explaining that he was 9 years ahead of Europe. Right, and the Chinese are investing all their electricity knowledge and technology in our European manufacturing cars, where we used to be in the front line, right?
Yeah.
And that transformation is not only has 2 points. One is that they are clearly doing these green transitions much faster than we do. We don't understand. And they are going to generate far more return than we even know, because within 20 to 30 years, they will run the show and we will just be, just following their lead. So just your comment on that.
I suppose I think, and this speaks to one of the questions that was asked at the previous panel as well, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think the fact that if India and China are moving faster than we are, and thank you, by the way, for including UK and Europe, I feel in Europe, that's not an opportunity for us as well. As you know, part of the thing that Rachel Reeves is trying to address is that most pension schemes in this country are massively invested overseas rather than in the UK. So, number one, we can take advantage of some of those growth opportunities in India and China and elsewhere. And I suppose the only other element that I would bring out is what some of the reaction to the Trump victory has been, that this should be forcing us in Europe to be far more cooperative, far more ambitious about our actions in, not just net zero, but biodiversity, because we're going to see one of the biggest actors probably withdrawing from the Paris Agreement again, taking the opposite of the kind of actions that probably, I imagine, collectively in this room, we would want them to take. So, and I think there is often far too much emphasis put on the role of investors or individuals. This is a real moment where government has to step up. Our government has to step up. The EU has to step up. It's a moment of enormous jeopardy, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you. I was interested in, you cited the Clean Growth Fund. I also know Beverly Gower-Jones, and she does a great job. But that's just a great illustration of the small size that it really means we get new money into the ground, new ideas, and the innovation that's needed. And I guess I would wonder what your views are when you get these larger and larger funds. Are they going to really have the bandwidth to do, you know, a 5 and 10 million allocation to a fund, which is 150 million in total? I mean, usually that's a ticket size for larger funds. And I guess the real risk is that they'll be just trading assets that already exist, and the whole additionality is going to get lost in the shuffle because it just doesn't move the needle.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, the proposal that I developed in my research, which was talking to pension funds about some of those challenges, that the bigger you get, you actually find it more and more difficult to find the appropriate deals to invest in. That if you have for example, a fund-of-fund umbrella structure for the National Wealth Fund, and then you have sectoral funds which are able to focus on particular challenges and much smaller ticket sizes. You know, there are process and structural design answers to your question, but that, you know, in a sense, the bigger question is, why aren't there the deals at scale in the UK that are appropriate for the investors at scale? And we know that is a problem. I mean, one of the really exciting initiatives in recent years has been Bristol City Leap, that you're also probably familiar with, where where the local authority, and Marvin Rees, who was Mayor of Bristol at the time, put together a 20-year growth strategy and a commitment. And then what happens is that the investors and the opportunities crowd into that structure. So if you create the sort of the policy certainty and the commitment, both as a local authority or indeed as a national government, you do get the investors and the deals come to the structure. Do you see what I mean? That it's not necessary, you can't do it on a deal-by-deal basis. And this is, I mean, it's the problem with the UK Infrastructure Bank. Tell me what I can see you're massively disagreeing. I'd love to know why.
I'm Elizabeth Carey. I'm an independent investment advisor for LGPS funds. So I guess it's my job to sort of ask the awkward questions. Also, my accent makes it easier for me to do it. No, I mean, I think what you're suggesting may work in certain places, or like, you know, King's Cross is also a great example of this, but I don't think you can necessarily judge it, you know, if we build it, they will come, because you can have also a lot of, you know, white elephants as well. But I guess what I'm really concerned about, I sort of disagree with you saying, you know, why don't we have bigger things in the UK? We actually do, but, you know, big things grow out of small things. And it's the most important thing is, you know, for creating jobs, for leveling up, or whatever it's called these days, is to have lots of different successful projects in innovation and circular economy, all this stuff, the stuff that people next to me are doing, funded all over the place. And yeah, then when they grow big, yeah, they do get sold to the Brookfields and the IFMs of the world, but those are not creating it. So it's how they creating these new businesses which can be successful, because we do have the IP.
Yeah.
That is the real issue. Money is not a scarcity. There's a global supply of money, you know, and they all compete against each other with low cost of capital. That's not the issue.
But I think the dimension that I would add to what you're saying is, I think the biggest disincentive to that kind of investment over the last 10 years has been the massive policy uncertainty. And you've just had a seesawing of uncertainty around, I don't know, renewable energy is a good example. What investors need is, they need a timescale that's appropriate for them. They need to know that there are guardrails, and then they will find the opportunities. So I don't think there's a lack of opportunities. I think there's a lack of policy certainty. And I do, if there's one thing I hope for, whether one disagrees or agrees with this government, is that at least the ministers stay in place for a reasonable amount of time, and this government stays in place for a reasonable amount of time, so that we have at least some policy certainty. Do you want me to stop? Yes. Thank you very much indeed.